Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Game Before the Money podcast, an oral history of pro and college football. Hi, everybody. I'm Michael Jackson. This is the Game Before the Money podcast. With me again is Upton Bell. We're going to be talking about the 2025 NFL draft coming up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And as usual, Upton is going to share some fantastic first-hand stories about the NFL draft. Upton's father, Bert Bell, created the NFL draft right before Upton was born. So Upton is going to share some stories about his childhood and the NFL draft. This is some fascinating stuff, including stories about living in the Ritz-Carlton in Philadelphia, where the NFL draft was held in the early days. Upton later worked for Don Shula in the Baltimore Colts scouting department in the 1960s. He's going to share stories about that, what it was like, what Don Shula's attitude towards the draft was like, and what it was like to be a scout back in those days. Upton's also going to share the player who scored the highest on the Wonderlic test during his time with the Colts. He's a Hall of Famer, and I think it's going to surprise you who it is. And of course, Upton's going to give you his thoughts on the upcoming draft. Who would he pick? Number one. Let's find out. Remember to visit thegamebeforethemoney.com. Remember, the Game Before the Money is a 501c3 nonprofit, and continuing this podcast and the website depends on contributions. Thanks so much to all the supporters, and let's chat NFL draft with Upton Bell. All right, well, Upton, of course, your dad invented the NFL draft, and that was shortly before you were born. What are some of your earliest memories of the draft? I'm curious about that.
Well, it's funny because, first of all, where they had the draft, the Ritz-Carlton, ironically, and I use the word ironically a lot, Michael, because of all the things that have taken place, but ironically, the draft was held at the Ritz-Carlton, his father's hotel, and his father was the man that said, "Bert, I love you. I bailed you out 100 times. You can hold the draft here. I'll take care of everything, but not one nickel for the National Football League. Not one." He said, I don't believe in it. College football is where it's at. But getting back to my early memories, I lived at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, among many other places, growing up. I was born in 1937. The first draft was in 1936. But I lived at the Ritz-Carlton, and then I lived at various places, depending upon whether it was good or bad, with my mother, my father, and 33 football players. So my early memories were basically always around kind of the game. From a very early age, I concentrated on listening to my father talk, because he always was either addressing people, talking to people, or even at home, growing up, there were telephones all over the place, because that's how he did business, other than when he went to the office. So I kind of imprinted my memory of all of the major phone calls that he had with owners, with other people, with dignitaries, and it kind of gave me that background that I've carried all through my life. So one important thing that I was made aware of this past week is that someday there's talk that the players, maybe not through the Player Association, but the college players might get together, as they did and sued the colleges to now where they're really pros. But the players one day might say, you know what, that draft is illegal. Why should we be forced to go to the dregs of the NFL if we're the top players? And until the Player Association agrees to that, who knows what will happen. But ironically, Bert Bell, I think, went to court 2 or 3 different times to protect the NFL draft. He was being sued by outside people and players at one time, and I can remember all his phone conversations. One, I think, was in a federal court, but he had to fight for the draft. I mean, that part of it you'll never hear at the celebration of the draft this year in Green Bay with all of the pomp and circumstance, how Bert Bell not only founded it, how he saved the league in many ways, but also how he had to defend it as commissioner years later.
Well, if you think about any other profession, if you're an accountant coming out of school, you don't get drafted by an accounting firm, and you can negotiate any offer that you want, law firms, whatever. If you're a lawyer, if you're a doctor, you don't get drafted, and it's one of those things in professional sports. So your dad came up with that idea, and that was to protect the struggling teams at the time, like his Philadelphia Eagles, right? Could you kind of give just a little bit of the backstory and how that helped keep the league going?
Well, first and foremost, I point out to people, and again, I'll be jumping around with you in this interview, but people said to me, why did you ever decide to be an owner and a part financer in the World Football League? I mean, you clearly only lasted 2 years. I said, because I had the experience as a young boy growing up, knowing that from the founding of the NFL in Canton in 1920, and it wasn't originally called the NFL, but eventually it was, that since then, up till, and what Bert Bell saw way ahead of everybody, up till 1936, the first draft, and in 1935, his proposal for it, 20-plus teams went out of business. I mean, there was no question in his mind, not only from a selfish standpoint, that his Eagles were losing money and could barely survive, that basically his understanding was, if we don't do something about this, we're all going under. And his reasoning was, too, that the teams that really dominated were really the New York Giants. Ironically, were the heaviest this year, the Green Bay Packers, the Giants, and the Packers and the Bears dominated, and everybody else was left eating cheese. So he saw that and looked back at the history where most of the owners, and particularly the ones who were doing well, the Maras, George Halas, and Curly Lambeau in Green Bay, they were looking out for themselves, and it was understandable. But when he went to the league meeting, and I believe it was in Pittsburgh in 1935, he said to the owners, he said, basically, my team is one of the teams that I'm paraphrasing that's dragging everything down. But if we don't do something about it, we're going to all be really in trouble. And he said, I am the perfect example. And basically, he had to fight to really get that pass through. And originally, George Halas didn't want to go for it, and he was really the power in the league at the time. And there are a few other owners, but Tim Mara, the father of Wellington, said he was the one that really kind of pushed it through for my father. And the other owners that were in deep trouble and said, you know what, if it's good for the league, I'm going to do what's good for the league. Now, you'll never hear that today. You'll never hear some billionaire say, you know what, it's good for the league, so I think I will take less money. Not going to happen. So there they were. This, I hate to use the term, these band of brothers that kind of knew with this, and it was a grand experiment, Michael, because no other league had a draft until the NFL did, that they were taking a step. And one of the other things that convinced my father, there was a player out of the University of Minnesota who was really a terrific, I believe, running back. His name was Stanley Koska. And my father had taken the train all the way out there to try and sign him. and Koska, kept saying, "Well, I think I'll sign." And then my father went up at like 2,000-3,000, which was like $1 million in today's money. And he kept saying, "Well, I'll get back to you." Finally, my father had enough of it, got on the train and came back. And Koska did sign with the Brooklyn Dodgers, which was a football team at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And my father said from there, "That's it. We can't do this. We can't be running around begging players to sign with us because we're not a team that are the Giants or the Bears or the Green Bay Packers." So that's how the brainchild happened.
There also was a situation, and it probably wasn't the only one, but it's probably the most famous situation, where Don Hudson had signed both with the Packers and another team, and the Packers contract got to the league office first, and therefore that contract stood. Do you remember anything about that story or stories about that?
I do. Yeah, but I mean, that was the chaos. Think if the other one got there first. I mean, and I believe somebody like Hudson, who was, as we know, a Hall of Fame receiver, I believe coming out of that, now what's the commissioner say? Now we got to check the postmark and this and that. You'd have had a suit over that.
That's true.
There is no question in my mind. Now, one of the other advantages, Michael, that my father had, once he became commissioner in 1946, his brother, Jack Bell, John C. Bell, his older brother, was at that time, first of all, their father was the Attorney General of Pennsylvania and one of the top people in negotiating with Teddy Roosevelt to save college football. His father, John C. Bell Sr., eventually became the Attorney General of Pennsylvania. His older brother and John C. Bell's son, John C. Bell Jr., then over the years became the lieutenant governor, then the governor when the governor moved on for a while, but then became one of the leading, not only lawyers in Philadelphia, but he ended up the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania. So my father, every time he wanted to write a rule and put it in the rules manual and the Constitution of the NFL, he consulted with his brother, who wrote strong wording in there to protect the commissioner, such as, my father used to use this a lot of times when an owner or somebody or player challenged him. He said, "Look it up. It's in the Constitution. The commissioner will act in the best interest of the game, not in the best interest of whomever it was." And he used that many times to put down any type of rebellion.
Wow, that is fascinating. That is fascinating. Well, with the draft coming up, Upton, a lot of people are going to be attending it. And, of course, you've mentioned before that nobody attended the first draft. What's the first draft that you were able to attend? Was that while you were working for the Colts, or were you able to attend while your father was commissioner?
Well, first and foremost, what is interesting about that day and why I still maintain, Michael, that you can have all the computers you want, you can have all of these pro days and all of the 2 or 3 days in Indianapolis. You can have everything you want, but you know what it still is? What it was that first year in 1936, it's a crapshoot. It always will be a crapshoot because the human being is involved in trying to judge something, and you can put it into the computer and take it out of the computer. It doesn't make any difference. But the reason that day was so interesting, and there were no media there, and it took weeks for the media to even write about it, is that all they were armed with were not computer studies, not personal workouts, not game film, nothing but Street and Smith magazine and calling out to some coaches that they knew around the country. Out of that first draft, you had 3 players, either 2 or 3 players, that made the Hall of Fame. And the other one, who would have been a great player in the NFL, Bear Bryant, decided not to play pro football, and of course went on to become the legendary coach at Texas A&M and Alabama. So they had nothing, and yet still picked 3 or 4 Hall of Fame players. One was Joe Steinhardt. So now we move all through the years. My first draft, I believe, was in Philadelphia, and my father used to have the draft at the Warwick or another hotel. And, of course, so I had a chance, both my brother and myself, to watch how it ran. And I can remember all of the different drafts and the way it was. And unlike today, where you have the hugging and all the other stuff going on and the spectacular, introduction of the players, Bert Bell used to go out and say, in the first round, Joe Blow was drafted by the Chicago Cardinals. What do you think, boys? That's what it was. and so he would have somebody record it, and then it would be given out to the media. But look back at all those drafts and how many players ended up in the Hall of Fame. And again, it began to be more refined each year. But still, it was note keeping, maybe some film study, a lot of personal contact with the coaches. If you called Bear Bryant, he'd say, "This is the boy I think you ought to draft." It was, again, until my first year as personal director of the Colts. This is after 2 or 3 years being the assistant personnel director. Gil Brandt in Dallas had essentially invented the computer and the computerizing of pro football. That changed everything to a degree. And of course, I followed suit. We joined a combination, and that's when teams began to band together to jointly scout players all over the country with reports shared by everybody. In Dallas's case, they did not. But you had the IQ tests, that's called the Wonderlic test. It was the IQ test, not so much how bright you were about, your studies, but how bright you were as far as football was concerned. How quickly could you make decisions? So all of that didn't come in till the 60s. And of course, during that period of time, I was learning, although I'd always been able to, because I was around football players as a kid, I developed theories about drafting players and what I would be looking for. And then when I left the ticket department and went into the scouting department in 1963, I began to develop my own ideas about the game and how to scout a player and adding all these other factors. So you could see how the game changed and what went on. And my memories of the drafts from the Colts standpoint was I look at the way it was done and I decided these are the ways I want to go. And I got lucky in a good way and in a bad way, because in 1964, when the two leagues, when they were drafting and stealing players as we were too, between the two leagues, it ended up in San Francisco. The night of the draft, the personnel director had a heart attack, and I was the de facto and did all the selecting, of course, with Don Shula. I remember Shula saying to me, "Good luck, kid. Don't screw it up." But out of that draft, I kind of established my bona fides with the coaching staff, and particularly with Shula. Is my first choice was Mike Curtis, who I believe still is a Hall of Fame candidate, should be one of the best I've ever seen. My second choice was Ralph Neely, who ended up signing with Dallas because he wouldn't sign with us because of the war between the two leagues, and he wanted to stay in Dallas, and the Houston Oilers were offering him a big contract. So he was my number 2 choice. Number 3 was Al Atkinson of Villanova, who ended up playing and starting and one of the best linebackers for the New York Jets. Number 4 was Marty Schottenheimer, who ended up playing for Buffalo. They were my first four choices.
Wow.
And from then on in, even though Shula and I would argue about certain things, that was it. Once he saw that I could do it, knew what I was doing, that kind of solidified it for me all the way through.
I think it's important to bring up how young you were at the time. You were still in your 20s, and you were head of the scouting department.
Oh, no, yeah, I was a kid. I was 64. I was just 26 years old.
Wow.
Most personnel directors and general managers were in their 50s and 60s. It's like everything in life, you got to be lucky. You've got to be at that right place at the right time. And I happened to be at that time. Now, the thing that did help me was that growing up and going to different training camps. In 1946, my father's first year as commissioner, basically my first training camp, other than being, as a kid with the Eagles, is at the age of 9, I went to the Bears training camp for 2 weeks just before the All-Star game. And I began to look, for instance, Sid Luckman, Hall of Famer, was the quarterback. Bulldog Turner was the center, another Hall of Famer. George McAfee was one of the running backs, another Hall of Famer. They drafted, I think, a year later, George Connor. So I began to, first of all, watch the quarterback and watch the movement of his feet. How quickly did he set up? How quickly did he get rid of the ball? Or what about pass protection, which was different in those days? What were the moves that a running back needed to make? So all of those things I began to just, even at the age of 9, put away in my head. And then over the years, I went to the Bears training camp. I went to the All-Star training camp. I went to the Redskins training camp. I actually saw Sammy Ball throw a football through a rubber tire at like 60 yards. I went like, holy shit, I can't believe this. So all of that, I went to the Cleveland Browns first training camp when they came into the league. So all of that background, I kind of put away, would make notes to myself at times, even as a kid. So I felt walking in there, even though I first started out when I was 24, 25, I felt I knew as much as anybody, but I was open to learning everything I could.
Oh wow, that's a great background, and you really did such a super job. And I was curious. You mentioned the college All-Star game that was played in Chicago every year between the NFL champion and a collection of college All-Star players. Now, can you talk about the games that scouts would go to on a regular basis every year? And was there kind of a camaraderie between the scouts? And what are some stories you remember about going to those games?
Well, let me take you back to 1946. And the NFL actually needed that All-Star game more than anything else, including their championship game. Because the All-Star game, and as I describe in my book, President of the Creation, is that basically you would draw people from all over the country. There were like 70, 80,000 people there for the biggest game of the year. And usually the All-Stars dominated the NFL. And hard to believe today, but the All-Stars, I thought two things. I thought the old All-America Conference, which now is getting all the records being absorbed by the Pro Football Hall of Fame in the NFL, I always thought the All-America Conference with the 49ers and particularly the Browns were better than the NFL before the merger. But I also know that the Chicago All-Stars, the first year I went to the Bears training camp, the All-Stars beat the Rams, who were the 1945 champions. And how do I remember? One of the things I really remember out of it was one of the most beautiful actresses and the it girl before Marilyn Monroe, Jane Russell, was married to Bob Waterfield, and my father gave her the trophy because he was named the most valuable player from the year before. And there I was standing next to Jay Mills. I said, my God, I knew there was something good about football. But the All-Star teams, and the following year, they beat the Bears, too, 2 years in a row. So the All-Stars were really, even though they were put together for only a couple of weeks, they would beat the NFL. In fact, a lot of people don't know this. One of the best players in the All-Star game going back into the middle, early 40s was Jackie Robinson.
Yeah, there's footage you can sometimes see online of him running a long touchdown against the Bears. I think they played the Bears that year, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think they did. But that backfield, by the way, and Kenny Washington, who was one of the players that I was there for the breaking of the color line in 1946 when the Rams went out from Cleveland to L.A., is I saw Kenny Washington, Woody Strode, run onto the field. Woody Strode went on to become a terrific actor in Hollywood, and Kenny Washington was part of that backfield of Kenny Washington and Jackie Robinson. And I argue that if you just go on and take a look at UCLA, they were the best team in college football and probably were better than the NFL. So,
well, and when you go back and you read the newspapers of the time, Jackie Robinson was known more as a football player than a baseball player.
Many people thought that Jackie Robinson's future was in the NFL. That's how good he really was as an athlete, period. I mean, he's a Hall of Fame baseball player. I think he would have been one of the greats, as well as Kenny Washington. And the sad thing about that was by the time that he got to the Rams, he would have really been in the middle of a great career, and it never really worked out. Now, the story behind that is that a couple of years earlier, George Halas, and I have never totally understood what happened because the NFL did have African-American players, and after Fritz Pollard, then there was nothing, and many people think it was an agreement among the owners not to have, but sign black players. I don't know that I totally agree with that, because I know my father would have never put up with that. And as soon as he became commissioner, he was the one that Rams go out to L.A. He knew that they could not play in the Coliseum unless they had African-American players. Now, this is all back history to the people who will listen to this, but these are true stories. George Halas, I think, wrote, or was either in his book or one of his daughters did say that he kind of had an agreement to sign Washington, then backed off it. And he said he always regretted that. And if he had gone to the Bears, you would have remembered him, Kenny Washington, as well as Gale Sayers and many of the other great backs, because the Bears always had them, Willie Gallimore, you name them. And they always had Sweetness, Walter Payton.
Oh, yeah.
Because they featured the running back. I think if Halas had kept his word, that Kenny Washington would be looked as one of the greatest running backs of all time.
Wow, that's fantastic. Now, we were talking about it kind of getting into to your days in scouting. Who are some of the players that really stood out to you when you were scouting? And again, I kind of like to know, do scouts kind of talk with each other and share kind of ideas back in your day? Was there a camaraderie in the scouting community?
Well, scouts always, because of the way you lived. You lived on the road. I saw all of America by the time I was 28 or 29. Because in those days you did fly to games in the fall, but even then, I drove all of America. Because you would drive from one place to another. You'd stay in a hotel or no, you stay in a motel, might be good, might be lousy, might be out in the middle of nowhere, the food sucked, everything. So we all kind of were traveling salesmen, we'd end up eating together. I mean, we wouldn't necessarily share all the information, but somebody might say, hey, up, you need to go down to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and take a look at that boy down there. You never know how good he's going to be. I don't know, but I'm just telling you. Well, there was a camaraderie because, unlike today, we kind of lived together. We'd see each other on the campus. I mean, I never went to any campus, big or small, particularly the African-American schools by that time, where there wasn't 1, 2, 3 scouts, and then going to the different all-star games. There might be 100 there. Everybody knew each other. And I'm sure that's true today, but there was a thing that we were all together in this. Even if we kept our own notes and we didn't share certain things in those notes, there was that feeling like, hey, we're all on the road together. We might be at Alcorn A&M out in the middle of nowhere, but we're here. So it was a very interesting time. And again, I developed a lot of friendships, a lot of people. Hey, listen, a lot of people don't like, even though he's gone, let's say Al Davis. And I would say, I used to see, even as general manager and owner, you would see Al Davis at all the All-Star games. You would see him at like the Senior Bowl, which is still around today. You would see him on different campuses. He's like being a trench coat, something out of 007. But he was a fascinating guy. And I mean, Buckle Tilray, who I hired and definitely belongs in the Hall of Fame, I saw him as a player and then as a super scout and then as one of the top people at the Cowboys. I'd see him all the time, talk out the side of his mouth and say, Bucko, are you sure you never worked in the CIA? So who are the players? I mean, you name it. Floyd Little, Larry Zonka, O.J. Simpson, Dick Butkus, Gale Sayers. It's a who's who. Tommy Novus of Texas, who, until he was injured, I thought was among the best. So I can't tell you how many great players. Archie Manning, Jim Plunkett, who we drafted here at the Patriots. I saw probably 30 Hall of Famers from every school. Otis Taylor, I remember it being at Prairie View, and they practiced at night. And their meal was like an orangeade and a sandwich. And I remember watching him run under 2 or 3, like 30, 40, 50-yard passes, and I said to myself, I don't care when he's drafted. That guy's a number 1 choice. And, of course, went to Kansas City, and he's just on the bubble of going in the Hall of Fame. Many of the best players I saw were at the African-American schools. So there was all of that situation. But I can tell you, I'm just naming a few off the top of my head. I could probably name you 30 or 40 players that are either Hall of Famers or just on the borderline of being them. I mean, guards, tackles, setters, running backs, quarterbacks, you name it.
Well, you brought up you brought up Prairie View A&M and HBCUs a little bit here, and that's a good bridge into talking about this year's draft, because one of the top prospects started at Jackson State, and that's Travis Hunter, the Heisman Trophy candidate. Who do you see as
best player in the draft? This is not a particularly good draft, number 1. But if you ask me to pick one player, as I would draft him as a receiver, and also let him play a little bit of defensive back. But a guy like Travis Hunter, years ago, people would be breaking down the doors to get him, because in those days, people did at times play both ways. But pure athlete, pure great intelligence, you name it. Now, you can either draft him as a receiver, or some people think he's a lockdown corner. I would say whatever your team needs, if you really need a terrific defensive back, he would be number one on both as a receiver and as a defensive back, as a corner.
Yeah, and that's pretty amazing to think about. And what I agree with you that Travis Hunter is probably, he would be my number one pick simply because, he was the number one player coming out of high school. And that really doesn't mean much of anything except for the fact that he's maintained that throughout college. He's still, after winning the Heisman Trophy, proving that he is one of the best players in the country at the next level. So I would see him as a pretty safe bet as an NFL pick.
Let me say this. There is no such thing anymore, or ever was, a safe bet. And the reason I say that is how many players that are really good, and I think he will be a great pro, but how many players come in, and the first factor, that's the most important factor, is injury. If he comes in, and today, the speed of the game, injuries were a big thing in the NFL, always have been. But because the players are bigger, quicker, faster, stronger, but more importantly, the way the game has really opened up, it's a speed game. In every aspect, you've got to be able to run. I remember one time at training camp, Weeb Eubank, and then later Shula had me, and particularly Eubank, because I ran track in high school and college, and I could run then a legitimate 4.6, 4.5 40. Now think about that. That the only player I couldn't beat at the Colts was Lenny Moore.
Wow.
So you think of that, about that time. Today, I wouldn't finish in the top 100. Guys are running 4.4s like it's nothing. And so the speed of the game, the hitting of the game, the hits were always vicious, and particularly in the 50s and 60s. They were vicious. But the players weren't that big and didn't hit with that speed that you have today. So the injury factor, listen, there are many more, but every time I turn on the TV, listen to the radio, this guy's injured in pre-training camp. Well, I'm saying, what the hell's going on here? But I understand what's happened. You could be the best prospect on the face of the earth, and you go to training camp, and all of a sudden, or you go to the pre-training camp, and all of a sudden, you've thrown your knee out. You haven't even hit anybody yet. That never happened back years and years ago. Now they're so finely tuned. They work out year-round, which I think, by the way, is too much. And so anything can happen. So we're talking about Travis Hunter. Suppose on the first play, whatever it is, his knee goes out. Now what? So I say, yes, a guy like Hunter, and there may be a few other people that can't be misses in the draft. I think the injury factor is bigger today than in anything else. And if you notice more and more, anybody who's had any type of injury, they keep going back and checking on him. And the reason is, it didn't used to be as big a factor. Okay, they say he'll recover, or we can do this or that. And certainly, particularly on the knee operations, you can do it today. Stephon Diggs, who's come here to the Patriots, now he had really a bad injury, and now they're saying he can come back by the second game. Well, probably that injury, he never would have come back if it was 40 or 50 years ago. But again, it's a question. because the minute you lose that speed or that quickness, you're dead in this game now. That didn't used to be. So I'm probably preaching too long on this, but I believe the greatest factor, three things I'd be looking for. How big is he? How quick and fast is he? And has he had any injuries?
Now, besides Travis Hunter in this draft, who else stands out to you? Who is someone that you would want to draft? Let's say if Travis Hunter is off the table.
Well, I'll tell you the guy that I would take next. He's a miniature version of Lawrence Taylor, and that's Abdul Carter of Penn State. He rushes you like he's going to kill you. He's midway between a defensive end and a linebacker. You know, you probably play him as an outside guy with the ability to rush, you know, from different positions. He is just an amazing player. He's a guy that basically you'd probably be a little bit worried about from a character standpoint. And by that, I don't mean he's a bad guy. He just, you know, he's gonna do his thing, as he says. So that's a guy that I would really, even if I had everything else, guys like that. I mean, we know that Lawrence Taylor was kind of a bad guy, always in trouble. But you know, he and Dick Butkus and Ray Lewis are three best I've ever seen, period, play the position. This guy is what they call kind of a tweener, but watch for him. He might go early. You might even see the Patriots do it. Who knows? But I think the biggest and most interesting question mark of this draft, what happens to Shedeur Sanders? And the person that they put slightly at him is Cam Ward of Miami, the two quarterbacks. There are other ones, but this is a year really devoid of any great quarterbacks coming out.
You know, it's not going to be a quarterback top-heavy draft like we've seen recently.
Well, last year, you know, just look at 1, 2, 3, and the Patriots. Drake May, barring injuries, should be a terrific quarterback. I mean, so, but you're not going to see that this year, and I think it's one of the weakest drafts as far as quarterbacks are concerned. But look at it. Tennessee is first. Are they going to take a quarterback? They've got Cam Ward of Miami and Shedeur Sanders. There are other people. I'm talking about those two. I don't think Tennessee will take a quarterback. Cleveland will take Travis Hunter if he's still around. Now, what do the Giants do? The Giants definitely need a quarterback. They've signed everybody but you, Michael. And so Shedeur Sanders is going to be facing them, and do they take him, knowing there's certain things? He doesn't have a great arm. He's a terrific athlete, pretty good runner, but what do you do? Do you take Cam Ward?
If he's still available. There's some talk that the Titans might take Cam Ward also.
That's what they said. But I trust people I know that have scouted them. And I don't know. I might fall back if I'm Tennessee. I might fall back to the best athlete available. Who's the best athlete available? Travis Hunter.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted to get a little bit of insight. You know, going back to the '60s Colts and you working for Don Shula. Was Shula? Did he strike you as more of a let's get the best player that's on the table or specific need?
He was both, but he was more specific. But we knew what we wanted. You know what I mean? When we took Bubba Smith, which I tried to argue him out of to a degree, he wanted to take him because he said, look at him, he's a terrific pass rusher. I said, he's also a goddamn jerk. I said, he's got everything. He's 6'7", 295. Think about that. That's in the 60s. He had everything except one thing. You never knew when he was going to show show up and play. The guy I loved, who till he got injured would have been a Hall of Famer, was George Webster. That's when Michigan State had those four great players: Clinton Jones, Gene Washington, and Bubba and George Webster. And we met with all of them because we had the number one choice in the country. And so I said, Bubba will give you what you wanted. We needed a pass rusher. I said, but Webster's a better player. So it all depended. We knew we were pretty specific what we needed at each position, and we were lucky to do it. When we took Mike Curtis, we didn't necessarily need him because, remember, he was also a running back as well as a linebacker. He played kind of both ways. And I said to Shula, I said, you'll play him for a year as a running back, just as a backup. I said, but eventually he'll be a linebacker, and of course that's what happened. I said the same thing about Ted Hendricks, who's in the Hall of Fame 2 or 3 years later, because he was playing a stand-up defensive end in those days for Miami, and everybody said, don't take him. He's a great player, smart as hell, high IQ, but he's 6'7", 195 pounds. I said, take him. So we finally took him on the second round, and I remember saying to somebody, I don't give a damn what you think. This guy's going to play, and I guess he did. I gave him he got the highest IQ test of anybody I ever gave it to. That's the Wonderlic test. And he came in the night for rookie camp, and he was half loaded. He still took the test at midnight and got everything but one question right. Said to Shula, don't worry about this guy. He'll memorize the playbook and tell you what you need to know. So there again, there's so many variables, and there were so many even then. So if we needed a specific person, now the year we took Bubba, we had 2 number ones. We had gotten the number one in the country for trading Gary Quazzo to New Orleans. And New Orleans, who had the first pick in the country, gave us the number one for Gary Quazzo. We still had our own number one, and there was a guy that we both really liked, Jim Detweiler, who was a tremendous player at Michigan. And he was big. He was like 6'2", 6'3", 225, 230 pounds, which was big then. Now back to injuries. He had a knee injury, but it looked like he recovered. And so we took a gamble, took him in the first round, and he only made it through the first 5 or 6 weeks of training camp. The knee went out again, that was it. That was the only real gamble I made in the draft. The other gamble was late in the draft, like on the 15th or 16th round, and that was a guy I convinced Chuck Noll. I said, this guy can play both ways. He could be a defensive back. He said, well, where did he play? I said, he never played football. He played at Illinois. His name was Preston Pearson. That was the best choice I probably ever made on a gamble.
He was a basketball player.
Basketball player. But I was big on drafting basketball players. And I remember Shula saying, what the hell's wrong with you? Just because Dallas drafted a couple. I said, just trust me. This guy has very quick feet, and he's a terrific defender. He's muscular. And so as it turned out, he came to our training camp. He made it as both a defensive back and a running back. He ended up playing for 4 Super Bowl teams. That's the best gamble I ever made.
All right, Upton. Well, it's been awesome talking draft history in this year's draft with you. Is there anything else that you think is important to add as we go into this weekend and the draft in Green Bay?
Well, first of all, it's great that it's in Green Bay, number one. I mean, how many times did my father make sure to try and save that franchise? First of all, by getting the money from CBS back in the 50s when Green Bay was going to probably not make it as a franchise because they didn't have a stadium. So he borrowed the money, and eventually Tex Schramm was the guy who had left the Rams and gone to CBS and was working in their sports swam there and lent him the money. He then said, I think it was $200,000. You could build a new stadium then for that. And it saved the franchise. And ironically, you'll see occasionally out on the internet or on YouTube Bert Bell making the speech at the Green Bay new stadium. And who was standing next to him, but you can't see him in the picture, was Tricky Dick Nixon. So that's great that it is there. But I think also the whole idea, which comes back of the draft, that the people don't really know the history. Just keep this in mind, anybody that listens to this interview. With all of the things you have, it's still a crapshoot.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Game Before the Money podcast. Remember to visit thegamebeforethemoney.com. Remember, you can also get Upton Bell's book, Present at the Creation. That's available online at all major book retailers. And you can also get the book, The Game Before the Money. Both those books are published by the University of Nebraska Press. The book, The Game Before the Money, features oral history interviews with 40 NFL legends. Remember to visit thegamebeforethemoney.com. Transcriptions of some episodes of the Game Before the Money podcast are available at thegamebeforethemoney.com and are powered by our transcription partner, Sonix, spelled Sonix. Visit sonix.ai to learn more about their automated transcription services.